कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Hello and welcome to Kitabnama, where I am talking today to journalist and author Mishi Saran. Welcome to the show, Mishi. It's great to have you here. And if I may be quite literal, it's been quite a journey, I think, from your first book, Chasing the Monk's Shadow, which was a travelogue, to your first piece of fiction out this year and shortlisted for the Commonwealth Prize, The Other Side of Light. Let's start with talking about Chasing the Monk's Shadow, how this book came about. 1400 years after Xuanzang, or Hyun Sang as we studied him in our history textbooks. So 1400 years after this Chinese Buddhist monk came to India, you decided one day that you were going to follow in his footsteps.
Yes, I mean, it was a sort of a long and circuitous route before I alighted on this idea. I mean, I had been studying Chinese in China, I had been working as a journalist in Hong Kong, and I sort of had this intellectual affinity and engagement with all things Chinese in a sense. And then at the same time I had this Indian heritage. I was born in Allahabad. I grew up for the first 10 years of my life in Delhi, and I had since left the country and lived in a number of other countries, and sort of suddenly at about age 30, 31 found myself with this strange disconnect of being Indian, thinking in an Indian way, and yet being fully preoccupied with China in my waking hours. And I felt the need to bridge this gap somehow. And the idea came to me to undertake a journey to somehow bridge these two territories in my mind. And the idea of Xuanzang popped into my head one day as a perfect guide, in a sense, to lead me on this journey which would link India and China. And that's how the idea was born in 1999.
Absolutely. And it is, of course, a very emotional point with Indians, at least. And I believe I was reading in one of the newspapers that very soon after Mr. Narendra Modi won the election, the Chinese premier called him up to congratulate him. And Mr. Modi reminded him of Xuanzang's travels to India and the fact that he had even visited his village in Gujarat. So there is a certain resonance. We all grew up with the history of this great Chinese scholar who came to India and who gave us not just the Buddhist texts but also a lot of our own history.
Yes, and actually, interestingly, Xuanzang was coming to India. The Buddhist texts were already in China, but they had been translated from Sanskrit and Pali into Chinese from the start of the millennium. And by the time Xuanzang was born in the 7th century, the translations had gotten quite garbled of these sacred Buddhist texts and sutras into Chinese. So Xuanzang's aim was to come to India, collect the original texts and retranslate them into a more comprehensible and logical version of Chinese. But in that process, I mean, it was a pilgrimage for him, but in that process he came and he observed very meticulously life in India, the landscape, the geography, the kings he met, the philosophies he encountered, and left an incredibly detailed account of his journey here, so much so that Indian historians now referring to the 7th century use his texts as a valuable reference.
And I think you do mention in the book as well that, you know, as Indians we tend to be less mindful of our history and more with our mythology and with the fables. And here you had this very exact, very meticulous account of which crop was growing where, and or really of life in the 7th century, which we perhaps would not have known but for this great account.
Yes, I remember specifically thinking that Xuanzang has left such a detailed account of the king Harshvardhan
Yes.
and his court, and I thought, well, I wonder if in the records of King Harshvardhan's court and his times there might be some mention of this illustrious Chinese traveller. So I actually looked up the poet Bana, who is the chronicler of Harshvardhan, and found in that account a very flowery, beautiful, poetic descriptions of, the bells on the elephant's feet and the dust and the glamour and the glory, if you will, of Harshvardhan. But there was no specific mention of this Chinese traveller.
Oh, there wasn't?
No, I couldn't find it. So I couldn't find in Indian sources a mention of this man's visit from China. All we have to go on of in terms of specific accounts is Xuanzang's own record of that journey.
That's right. And of course, when you retraced this journey rather more comfortably, I would say, because you had aeroplanes and buses, not always very smooth rides, but very, could be bumpy along the way. And yet you did, in a sense, also retrace a lot of what we today would regard as contemporary history. Kashmir, Afghanistan, Ayodhya, and the whole rumbling, because I think your travels were around 1999, 2000. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's inevitable when you are, and that had sort of partly been my aim. I had a loose idea of how I would write this book, but the idea became firmer and took a more concrete shape while I was on the road. I mean, my training was, in fact, as a journalist, and although I'm very drawn to the past, because it seems to me that the roots of what are happening today often lie in the past, but what was happening around me was so compelling as well, and forced me to record and comment on it as well.
So in a way you did play it by ear, as it were, on the road.
Yes.
Or did you know when you set out exactly what you were looking for?
I knew roughly that I wanted to trace this monk's footsteps, and I didn't have an idea of how accurate I wanted to be. I had an initial idea of where he went. I had some help from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, who provided me with a very detailed list, at least in China and Central Asia, of the old name of these cities, these 7th century cities, with the modern names of where these cities had then shifted to, because cities, of course, are not static things like rivers. They move from one place to another. And that was very helpful. In fact, all along the way, I had a lot of help from archaeologists, historians, people who really knew their stuff, including from the Archaeological Survey of India, who were very kind and helpful on many occasions in helping really an amateur historian retrace these footsteps. And so the account kind of built itself as I went along. The story wrote itself as I traced that journey.
And it wasn't always smooth. I mean, you had some hairy moments as a woman traveling alone in Uzbekistan, and of course in Afghanistan, which almost didn't happen.
Yes, I think Afghanistan was probably the most frightening part as well, because in a sense I was in a war zone, and it's very strange to be in a war zone doing historical research. You feel, I mean, I felt completely out of place. You feel like how is this important? How important is my search for a Buddhist monk in the 7th century in the midst of, the Taliban shooting, left, right and center, cities under siege, bombs blowing up. But in retrospect, I think it was very important. I think it's very important to remember that that people have not always been at war, that these routes have been peaceful routes of trade and of connections, of ideas and philosophies. And I think Xuanzang really is a very important symbol in these times of the important things we can learn from each other, and how important it is to have these connections and intellectual exchanges and to keep the conversation going. Because when there's no conversation, all kinds of hideous things emerge, really, and hatred and war.
Absolutely, but you were traveling through Afghanistan at a time when the Taliban was in denial of a history that predated Islam almost. The Bamiyan Buddhas had been destroyed, and so how open could you have been about the fact that you were really on a historic mission and you were not a journalist reporting on a war?
Well, I had to be very open. It was really my only chance. I mean, even with Pakistan, I'm not a Muslim. I didn't have relatives in Pakistan. It took me 1 year to get a visa to Pakistan. But I was very open. I wanted to go to the border areas. I wanted to go to Swat. I wanted to go to Hund and Attak and the Indus River. And I was very open about my purpose even with the Taliban. And in the end, in Afghanistan, I was assigned a very genteel, elderly man who turned out to be a professor. He had been a professor at Kabul University and had 2 daughters my age. And he was my guide through Kabul, ostensibly working for the Taliban, but he too had an earlier history which was unconnected to all the violence.
That's right. In fact, I think in Afghanistan, strangely enough, it was the aid organizations that aided you the least. Right?
Yes, correct. I mean, in some ways it's understandable. I'm sort of a wild card in an already stressful situation.
Yes.
I didn't belong to any organizations. I didn't belong to I didn't have any institutional backing. And that can actually be very threatening to a lot of people, but it's also a strange kind of protection. And it made me sort of realize in a way that perhaps Xuanzang had been in a similar situation. He was doing this solo. He didn't have the backing of the Tang emperors. He got funding and help as he went along on the road. He was sort of at the mercy of people, and he kind of was following his search, and I was following him. So he turned out to be a good guide.
That's right. You talk, of course, of being daunted and utterly inequipped. Were there times where you just wanted to stop following this monk's journey, this journey that took place 1400 years ago? Did you ever ask yourself, what am I doing here? I just want to go home.
Well, of course there were moments, but I have to confess that once that happened, probably a week or so into the journey, and I just had this thought, oh my God, what have I done? But there was absolutely no way to go back. I had given up my flat, I'd given up my job, I had said goodbye to everybody, put everything in storage, and there was nothing to do but go on forward. And then I got addicted. And it was this incredible constant learning, this search for what am I going to learn around the next corner, because everything I learned was mind-bogglingly interesting. And then I just didn't want to stop.
I can imagine. Jan Morris talks of travel writing as something that is more real than fiction, but more genuine than mere fact too. And I just wanted to ask you that in this day and age where there are no new worlds to conquer, everybody has been there, done that. You have travel shows being beamed into your drawing rooms 24/7. You have Lonely Planet guides, and you have the sort of, guidebooks being churned out. What is the space of a travel writer? How do you see your role as a travel writer?
Well, I don't really consider myself a travel writer. I think of myself just as a writer. And honestly, I don't think it's about remoteness or lack of access. I think you can be a traveler if you step out of your drawing room and go visit a place that you've never been to, even if it's a market you've never been to. Being a traveler, I think, is the sensation of seeing something with very fresh eyes, whether it's a situation or a place or a person even that you haven't seen in a long time. I don't think it has much to do with how far away the glacier is or how high the mountain is. You can be an equally wide-eyed traveler if you step out and go to, say, a market that you've never traveled to, or a fish market that you've never been to, or a region of India that you've never been to. It doesn't matter how many news cameras have been there before you. It's your own interpretation and your own view of the situation.
And for you personally, is your travel writing also to do with self-discovery? Because you've spent so few years in India, and yet you identify yourself as an Indian woman, obviously.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it was a delightful way. One of the reasons why this was so addictive is I felt I was discovering more and more about my own country. And it was a marvelous way to see these small and obscure and yet once upon a time such important parts of India. Take Bihar, for example, the ancient land of Magad, where the Buddha preached, and it was the capital of King Ashoka. And of course, these days Bihar tends to be a little bit of a drawing room joke. But it used to be the seat of an enormous amount of learning and an enormous pillar really of in Indian history. And I think it's worth remembering these things and worth going back to look at, say, Bihar with fresh eyes.
What I found also very remarkable about the book is also its almost lack of judgmental finger wagging. So you do go to Ayodhya and you do go to a lot of, the Krishna Janma Bhumi, and you touch upon these, and of course Kashmir was traumatic for you, but you're not really questioning, and you talk about the beauty of faith and the beauty of devotion in a way that is very non-judgmental.
Yes, I don't think it has to do with, the troubles don't have to do with faith and devotion. I think it's when politicians try and use that for their own ends. And the sad thing that has always struck me is that, in these devotional wars is how young the people involved are. And these are young people who are searching, and their search has been co-opted and used for very nefarious purposes. And that to me in some ways is the saddest thing. But yes, I have no judgments. How can I judge? I'm there to observe as accurately and as precisely as I can, and that is what I see as my duty and my role actually, and what gives me the most pleasure.
Absolutely. In many ways, I find that the seed of your essay, A House for Mr. Tata, which is part of the anthology called Travelling In, Travelling Out, edited by Namita Gokhale, the seeds really are to be found in your previous book, aren't they? The roots of Zoroastrianism, which you encounter through your travels along the Silk Route in Central Asia. And then you have this very revelatory for me essay, where you talk about Parsis and San Francisco and Russians and Hong Kong. Yes. How did that come about?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I had been living in Shanghai since 2006, and Shanghai, I had sort of fallen in love with Shanghai as a city and had the great pleasure and privilege of slowly discovering its layers of history. I tend to think of it as an onion. And the deeper you go into this onion, the more extraordinary are the things that you find out. And I had no idea that so many Indians had been in Shanghai at the turn of the century. I had no idea that Parsis had been living in Shanghai. And when I found out about this gentleman, Mr. Tata, and his house, it just absolutely blew my mind. And this was a story that I had to explore and find out more. And it was yet another way in which China and India had all these connections before the modern era, really. And these are all things which I think are so important to remember.
Of course, and the whole idea of home and property and identity and belonging is something that would have great resonance here in India, because we do look at a lot of partition property, for example, even Jinnah's house in Bombay. So this becomes difficult, in a modern world where you have uprootedness and identity. And how do you reconcile it? So, what do you think would be the end of Mr. Tata's house? What hope is there for him?
Well, I think the point of Mr. Tata's story is that he was one individual who had the misfortune of just being in that time and space of this historical sweep, if you will. He was just one individual who lost everything, who lost his house, who had to leave the country where he'd built a whole life. And I suppose the point is to take this and take this house that he's left behind in China and this historical accident, and to perhaps hopefully make it into something truly memorable and a symbol of something positive, maybe a symbol of friendship and connection versus a symbol of something that was lost forever.
Okay, coming to your latest book, first of all, congratulations, because it has been shortlisted for the Commonwealth Prize. The Other Side of Light, it's quite a switch, isn't it? So from travel and your shorter pieces, you come to fiction. How did that happen?
Well, in a sense, I think fiction has sort of always been nibbling at my heels, and I've always felt I wanted to try my hand at fiction and write this novel, but I think I was too frightened. I think it took me a lot of writing to summon the courage to write something that's fictional. After all, non-fiction or travel, your story has a chronological scaffolding you can hang the story on, but with fiction it really is the blank page. And it was possibly as frightening to me to write fiction as it was to set off on the travels in Xuanzang's footsteps. But I must say it was a very rewarding, very wonderful process, and I think it actually changes something very deep inside you to write fiction and to try and dip into your resources and write fiction.
So what next?
Well, I hope another book of fiction. I'm working on it slowly. I'm trying to create the time and space for it. It's also set in Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s. And I have learned not to question too much the process, and I have learned to follow the process and let it take the time it needs. And if it turns out that it doesn't happen, then I've also learned to let go.
Okay. Do you think you'll ever get back to doing a travelogue of the length, magnitude and ambition as your first book, Chasing the Monk's Shadow?
It's quite possible. I have a young daughter who's almost 4 years old, so it won't be for a while yet if I do anything like that. But I loved my journey so much. Raising a child is a different kind of journey, and it's a totally different kind of adventure, equally demanding. And somehow the two have to coexist.
Great. It's been wonderful talking to you. Welcome home, if I may say that, if Delhi
Thank
is
you.
home.
Yes,
and I
very
think
much
it
so.
is. And thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thanks a lot, Namita, for having me.
It never required much to begin a conversation in Sri Lanka. The very air was primed for it. In a country so full of uncertainty, all life and all death was rehearsed through conversation. It was a form of art, well honed and practiced with skill. Just so much information was solicited as given. Threads of thought spun out into fractals. Conversations became explorations, really, shifting and moving and pushing gently at the boundaries of their author's knowledge. Time, never in a hurry in Sri Lanka anyway, slowed down even further. My friend Sanjaya was one of the masters of this art. He was a big man in every way, tall and broad and nearly bald, and then with a personality that was even larger than his physical frame. Sanjaya was an intermittent journalist, having studied briefly in Madras. He would work producing news documentaries for a few weeks, nose diligently applied to grindstone. Then his pace would slacken and he would play video games and watch movies for a couple of months. It was impossible not to like him. He was curious about everything, and he told yarns tall and magnificent, embellishing on the run and possessing such a fondness for the absurd that he giggled as if he were hearing the tale and not narrating it. When he laughed, his eyes narrowed into letterbox slits. He quivered noiselessly, and his shoulders heaved. His mirth was tectonic. When I moved to Colombo, I first stayed with Sanjaya in his family's house on the outskirts of the city. We had several friends in common, but Sanjaya was also a popular point of first contact for journalists arriving in Sri Lanka. It was, I think, because of his eternal willingness to sit and swap stories, to examine all Sri Lanka and even all creation over a single bottle of beer. Journalists yearn for people like Sanjaya. "Come, we'll go to Machang," he'd say. And so we'd set out for the pub, which was owned by a brewing company and served its beer in tall plastic towers with a core of ice. A dour fug of smoke always hung in its rooms, and Sanjaya added to it with frequent, well-relished cigarettes. Around us, young men in tight T-shirts inhaled their beer and ate hot-buttered cuttlefish and played pool. "So I met this guy in Mullaitiyu, right?" Deep drag. "He got 25,000 rupees because he was a refugee, and he set up a local cinema with it. He has a 25-inch television and a DVD player and a generator and 30 or 40 chop socky movies from the 1980s. Silent laughter. Deep drag. "And during the day, he charges mobile phones on his generator. This is his living." Deep drag. "I wonder what the other refugees do with the money they get." This was how Sri Lanka sucked me in deeper and deeper, by discussing itself incessantly. The more I listened to Sanjaya and then to others, the more the country and the history of its war revealed itself to me. A bigger, clearer picture always dangled just out of reach, around the corner of another conversation or two. Sanjaya made me realize that all I wanted to do was to wander around the island and talk about the one subject that everyone wanted to talk about. The war loomed too close to hand and too enormous for my senses to grasp it properly, like a wall that spread away to infinity in every direction. But in conversations, I heard stories of individuals, fantastic or tragic or melancholic or even happy stories, stories that had human proportions and that could be multiplied in my head to gain a larger truth. It was like this when I had first visited Sri Lanka too, with a friend in 2004 for a holiday. A ceasefire was officially in force, but the tigers and the army still attacked each other with regularity, as if they were keeping themselves in practice for the eventual return to open warfare. The streets of Colombo teemed with barriers and security checks. We were advised to carry our passports wherever we went. Once, in a trishaw, we asked our driver if the fortified white building we had passed was Temple Trees, the Prime Minister's residence. He half turned around and rolled a suspicious eye over us, wondering why we wanted to know. On our second night there, after my friend had gone to bed, I was still restless and I went down into a club in the hotel basement looking for a drink. I sat at one end of the neon-lit room. At the other end was a man sitting amidst 3 women on a couch. Unrecognizable music poured through tinny speakers. There was nowhere else around. It was the most profoundly depressing club I had ever visited. After 15 minutes, the man loped over and sat on the next chair. He never once glanced around at me. He gazed steadily at the women and asked in English, "Which one of them would you like?" I explained that I wasn't in the market. He shrugged affably and continued to sit beside me, both of us sipping our drinks. Then a question struck him. "Are you a tourist?" "I was," I said. He nodded very rapidly, 7 or 8 times in a row. "So what do you think?" he asked. "Will the ceasefire hold?" It had been a smooth, easy transition from the subject of prostitution to the subject of the war. I sat on for another half hour, talking politics with a pimp.